In 1985, the NES was released in North America along with Duck Hunt, which contained the NES Zapper, a light gun that enabled players to aim at the screen and shoot ducks out of the sky. It is always the example I point to as the accessory that harnesses the technology available at the time and implements it to great effect, providing customers with a unique experience for a reasonable price, as well as a product that felt like it had received Nintendo's stamp of quality assurance. The Zapper is unfortunately in many ways going to contrast with the subject of today's video. Allow me to introduce you to the NES Powerglove. The Powerglove is an alternative NES controller that contained a wide variety of buttons which activated different ways for the glove to recognize players' hand movements as inputs. It's the early idea of motion controls. The Powerglove is a classic example of trying to run with a technology that is very much still learning to walk. The idea of virtual reality was being researched heavily in the 80s, as many companies were trying to find the best ways to utilize this new technology. Some companies saw applications for it in medical fields for research purposes and so on. But where other companies saw research, game companies in particular, and more specifically toy companies, saw an opportunity. The race to commercialize new technologies often leads to rushed development times, which end up causing products to fail. The NES Powerglove was unfortunately a victim of this. A tale of a good idea that needed more time in the oven, only to be thrown out into the market for one Christmas buying season too early. To understand more, we need to take a quick look at the technology that it was based upon. I will be skipping through the more tedious information, as I don't tend to like these videos to drag on unnecessarily. In 1982, Thomas Zimmerman filed a patent for an optical flex sensor mounted in a glove that could measure finger bending. Originally, Zimmerman had a fascination with the technology because he was an avid musician, thinking that the glove was capable of tracking hand and finger movements, and it could be used to control instruments such as electronic synthesizers. Jaron Lanier worked at Atari and shared Zimmerman's interests in electronic music. They worked on improving the design of the glove together, and in 1985 they started up a company called VPL Research. VPL went on to release the VPL Dataglove in 1987. It even appeared on the front of Scientific American. VPL at this point was pushing forward with full-body motion tracking systems, head-mounted displays, and even virtual reality systems for multiple people. It's important to note that the Dataglove was just one of their many products. The Dataglove could measure a lot of information, including the pitch and rolls on every axis. The fiber optic sensors had a resolution of 256 positions, or 8 bits per finger for 4 fingers. They did not bother including sensors for the little finger, as it usually did not move independently, and its position closely mirrored the ring finger. All we need to remember from this is that VPL products were very high-end, they cost tons of money, and they had a ton of sensors that could measure all different sorts of movements in great detail. This is where the basis for the technology was. Now let's look at how they went from an $8,000+ VGL glove to a $75 controller for the NES. A company called Abrams Gentile Entertainment, or AGE for short, started as a marketing and design company that created movie posters. It eventually expanded into toys and is mainly known for its series of widely successful Rambo toys. From here, AGE began expanding its engineering and design departments. This was mainly to help optimize and reduce the cost of its ongoing toy production. In the late 80s, AGE began seeing that the video game industry was beginning to turn around, with their original focus being on entering the market with their own 3D console. At this time, AGE had reached out and licensed the entertainment rights to the VPL Dataglove technology, specifically the flex sensor patent. AGE's philosophy was to do away with traditional controllers and gamepads in order to create a more immersive gaming experience. It's important to note that Nintendo dominated the video game market during this period. At this point, there were many prototypes of the Powerglove, as they had been playing around with the technology that they had licensed, and AGE was unable to find a company that was willing to adopt their product and partner with them in order to enter the market. It really came down to the fact that AGE realized they couldn't compete against Nintendo, so they had to adapt their vision to work with Nintendo. AGE modified the Dataglove using a Macintosh computer to control NES games with their Dataglove. Once this was working, AGE approached Mattel to pitch the idea of the NES Powerglove. Mattel saw the potential in the product and really wanted to get it out for Christmas, which was only just months away. From this point, Mattel and AGE worked together to bring down the cost of the glove. was far too expensive to be able to manufacture. The engineering team only had around 5 months to develop the Powerglove from concept to commercially viable product. This is a monstrous task to take something that is cutting-edge technology, try to make it cheaper, and yet somehow manage to maintain functionality while balancing out the concept of being profitable. In hindsight, it's really easy for us to see how this is a complete disaster in the making, and eventually Mattel did bring down the cost to about $23, but this was done at the expense of removing some of the more necessary fiber optic and magnetic tracking sensors, replacing the technology with conductive inks and ultrasonic tracking. How ultrasonic tracking worked was there were 2 ultrasonic speakers built into the glove. These emitted a signal that was picked up by the 3 ultrasonic microphone sensors you would need to place on top and along the side of your TV. The signal that the glove would emit would change according to which fingers were bent in the glove. This was done according to the flex sensors that were using a carbon-based ink, which meant that basically when you flexed your fingers, they compressed, the sensors decreased the amount of resistance, and changed which ultrasonic signal was being sent to the ultrasonic microphones, which interpreted that information. Naturally, the microphones were also able to pinpoint where exactly the hand was, and that gave you that fluid movement that we are accustomed to when we are looking at Wii motion controls, for example. When using cheaper technologies, you end up losing a lot of information and running into accuracy issues. As discussed earlier in the original VPL Dataglove, it could track a lot of variety of movements and 8 bits of information per finger. Now, the Powerglove could only track a few positions and 2 bits per finger, not to mention the numerous limitations of the product, which we will discuss later on. Mattel at this point had a functioning product that they could pitch to Nintendo, and Nintendo wasn't really that interested, believing that the glove would be too cumbersome and complicated for children to operate. Nintendo was keenly aware that targeting the younger generations and ensuring that they could purchase their products was important. The Powerglove was not only a strange controller configuration, but it was also in no way, shape, or form easy to use. With multiple modes and a large manual of various different motions and movements, not to mention the ultrasonic speakers that needed to be mounted to the TV for it to be usable to begin with. It's no wonder that Nintendo was extremely hesitant to license the product. After long discussions and Mattel going back and forth to the negotiating table, Nintendo finally agreed to carry the product, and this was just in time for Christmas. The issue at this point was there was virtually no time to develop any games that could make use of the Powerglove's unique motion controls. 54 NES titles had retroactively had control schemes mapped to the controller, but you needed to refer to a manual to input a code in order to activate the correct input controls. If the game wasn't supported in the manual, then you could still select an input scheme that you would like to use with that game. The controller was sold as a standalone product, it didn't even come with a game bundled with it for obvious reasons, and only 2 games were ever launched for the Powerglove that made use of the Powerglove and had unique inputs for the Powerglove specifically. Bad Street Brawler, which was a game that came out 2 years earlier on the Commodore 64 and a few other consoles. The game was then repurposed for the NES version with the Powerglove in mind. It was basically a side-scrolling beat-em-up, wasn't particularly well received by fans, and the second title was Super GloveBall, developed by none other than our favorite game studio, Rare. Now, Super GloveBall was developed straight away from day one with the Powerglove in mind. Launched in 1990, a few months before Nintendo canceled the Powerglove altogether, it was the only game that truly made use of the Powerglove's motion controls. It launched so late into 1990 that all the hype for the Powerglove had died off at this point, and it ended up selling so poorly that other titles that were planned for the Powerglove were also canceled. There were 3 other games that were announced but never released: Glove Pilot, Manipulator Glove Adventure, and Tech Town. In Japan, the glove was released, but no Powerglove specific games were ever retailed, so the Powerglove over there was truly just an alternative controller. Even though the controller ended up grossing $88 million, it really was a failure in the minds of the masses, and let's discuss why. Firstly, the Powerglove was based on $8,000+ Dataglove technology. Somehow making it for $23 was probably going to run into some issues. And it did. The Powerglove was pretty inaccurate and difficult to set up. It had a lot of issues with titles that required precise inputs, often misreading user inputs, a problem that we see even today in some Switch titles. And that's in 2023. You can imagine the level of interference that the ultrasonic sensors received and how that impacted it trying to read player inputs. Secondly, there was no game support. Because of the rush to get it out for Christmas, there was no time for developers to actually make use of the functionality. Sure, Rare managed, but that was 9 months after the glove had launched, and way after all the marketing and hype for the product had died off. If they had waited another 6 months for the Powerglove, actually spent time developing titles that would make use of it, then there probably wouldn't be this issue. Even the titles that were specific for the Powerglove could be played on a regular controller. The Powerglove simply just had a few unique moves that could be accessed. Just goes to show how there was no time for anything. Slapping control schemes on titles that gameplay was never meant to incorporate motion controls was never going to be a good idea, and it ended up feeling terrible. Players just returned to using the NES controller as soon as the novelty of the Powerglove wore off. To be considered a good controller, you actually need to be able to work as a controller, and unfortunately the Powerglove just simply didn't do that. If you tried to play any of the titles with a Powerglove, you're going to know right away that squeezing your hands together or dipping your hand forward and back in order to push an A button is just not a good idea. Overall, the product, while it was ambitious, it's clear from the get-go that the intent was to make it out for Christmas season come hell or high water. The massive marketing that was put behind it, with advertisements released all over TV and in newspapers, and it ended up showing up in movies like The Wizard. The Powerglove product placement in that movie was so woven into the script, I actually had to double check that it wasn't a Michael Bay Transformers spin-off. The Powerglove has become a strange part of Nintendo's history. It is essentially the father of motion control concepts in gaming. Although it did end up selling 1.3 million units, the fact that it was cancelled only 1 year after release goes to show that Nintendo was never really behind the product. That's been it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. If you like the content, then consider leaving a like or a comment below. Subscribe and hit the bell. I don't have a fixed upload schedule right now, so you might miss an upload. See you in the next one.